talk a lot about learning. In fact, we're here as part of the community of human and organizational learning. So it's what it says on the tin. But learning can sometimes be a little bit like culture, in that we say this word a lot and we don't often think about what it is, and more importantly, how we do it in our organization. One way we can define organizational learning is the creation, the transfer, and the retention of knowledge over time. And so that's at an individual level, an organizational level, but particularly at an organization, we've got to think about, so what does it mean to create knowledge over time? What does it mean to transfer and share that knowledge over time? And what does it mean to retain that? And we talk a little bit about institutional knowledge, which is how we actually take what people learn as individuals and translate that into organizational knowledge and capability. So when I thought specifically about safety learning, using that as a definition, it led me to sort of define safety learning as how we create, transfer, and retain knowledge about safety risks and controls, and how that's linked to the work, which is influenced by organizational factors. And so why I put so much in that definition, because when we think about safety, it has to be about the understanding and the management of safety risks. It also has to be about the linking of those risks to the operational work that is performed in an organization. And it also has to be about how that operational work is shaped or influenced by organizational factors. So we're starting to define some boundary or scope of things that we want to understand better in our organization, and things that we want to be able to make more common and more shared, and hopefully more transparent, stable, and sustainable in our organization. What it is not communication, and it's not compliance. And a lot of the learning, quote unquote, that we do, or things that we do that we call learning, is barely communication and even compliance. So for example, if you have an incident in your organization and you do an investigation and you prepare a lessons learned document, and the use of lessons in most of those documents is probably not appropriate, and then you send that communication to a bunch of people with a bunch of compliance actions, that's not learning. It's not effective communication, because effective communication is all about shared understanding, and that is not about creating shared understanding. And it's definitely not really about deep compliance, because deep compliance is about understanding and delivering on the intent. So at best, that process I've just described is a transactional surface level compliance activity inside an organization. So we can start to think about, organizations that say, why are we not learning from our incidents? My conclusion to that in most organizations that I've been exposed to is because you don't actually have a learning process. Learning needs time. Learning is not something that, always can happen very, very fast, particularly when we're exploring complex topics, when we're involving diversity of perspective, when we're challenging our assumptions and our mental models, and we're integrating new knowledge into our existing knowledge, and constructing new ways of seeing the world and navigating the world. So it takes time. It needs to have a process wrapped around it. So this is where, and you'll start to see when I go through these things that learning needs, you might go, oh, gee, we maybe don't spend enough time on this specifically. Or you might go, oh, now I'm starting to wonder if we do actually have a process. Learning actually also requires interaction with people in the world around us. When it comes to understanding our organization, learning about our organization, It needs to involve interaction with people in the world around us. It means that we need to think about learning as a verb. Learning is something we do. So, how much does our process involve that interaction? It needs to involve the creation of new knowledge or the application of knowledge in new contexts. So, this creation of new knowledge is really important. And if I cycle back to my overly simplified comments about lessons learned documents, we should really challenge ourselves to, have we created new knowledge, or are we just reinforcing and resharing stuff that we knew but maybe someone didn't do? So there's no real new knowledge generated there, and there's unlikely to be the application of that knowledge in new contexts. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do all of this in a moment. Change. So learning is really interesting because if nothing changes, we haven't learnt anything, because learning should lead to change. It should lead to change in organizational functioning, change in organizational behavior, change in individual decision-making, and action in our organization. So evidence of learning should show up in material or observable changes to the way that the organization functions. Some of what I regard as the better work on the health and safety profession was done by Professor David Woods up at Ohio State. Coincidentally, the location of this year's CHOL conference in June up in Columbus. And he did some work with NASA after the Columbia Space Shuttle incident, where they had him come and review the NASA safety organization. And he proposed this model of, the 4 eyes of a safety organization. And he said that, and when we go underneath this model, like I'm going to do now, you can see it's all about learning and change. He said that a safety organization needs to be both independent and involved. So we need to be independent enough, socially, cognitively, organizationally, to be able to see things in a way that the people who are close to the action don't see. So we can bring the opportunity to create new knowledge and new models of work and new understanding of risk to the operation. But we need to be involved enough to be able to shape the ways of thinking and the decisions and the actions of that operational unit. So you can see how this is very much a learning to change type of role. And also, the other 2 eyes of the model were that the safety team should be both informed and informative. So we need to be informed about what's going on, but we also need to, help the business to be able to understand the way it functions in a way different to what it currently thinks is going on. So that model and a range of other work into the health and safety profession really promotes this idea that as safety professionals, we are nothing if not facilitators of organizational learning processes. So how can we get our leaders more engaged in learning within our organization? The first is we need to help our organization understand the value. I think every organizational priority starts with the value that it creates for the organization. So, we can talk a lot about the need to learn, but in doing work with some organizations recently, senior leaders are getting a little bit frustrated in all this talk about learning from some of the leaders that I interact with. They're saying, yeah, we know we need to learn, but their frustration is because they're saying, but we're not sort of seeing any value or any change in our organization as a result. Lots and lots of potentially learning teams, lots of things, but it's like, well, what value's been created from this learning? And their evaluation of value translates into what's changed in the organization and what's the positive impact of that change on organizational functioning. So we need to be able to help explain and the value of learning by helping them understand what an end-to-end organizational learning process looks like. We need to help leaders understand their role in how they actually promote organizational learning as a priority. and how they create a supportive environment for knowledge sharing. We also need to help them and the organization sort of understand this shift. And I really like this language that's used in the organizational literature around moving from an individual sort of blame logic to an organizational function logic. And I know many of you will be familiar with human and organizational performance, but this is a much deeper model that talks to that double loop learning, how we can start to really have our organization fascinated about organizational functioning, irrespective of the actions of an individual at a point in time.